Hello, everybody. Welcome to the upper appendage bone tour is what I'm going to call it. So in this lesson or this video, I'm going to cover the bone names and markings of every part of the upper appendage. So I'm going to start with the scapula and the clavicle, which is part of the pectoral girdle, and then the upper limb, which includes your humerus, radius, ulna, all your carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. So what you can see here first is the scapula. This is the posterior view. This is the anterior view. Lateral view. Medial view. Trying to figure out the camera and the mirror imaging. So then I'm just going to walk through the bone list. So we have the bone list here. I'm going to start with those markings on the scapula first, and then I'll go to the clavicle, which are both part of the pelvic girdle. All right. So if we take a look, the scapula has the body. So the body is the bulk of all of this, kind of the flat part of the bone, kind of like what I'm pinching there. So that's the body of the scapula. Then we have the spine, which is this part right here. So that's the spine. And then we have borders and angles. So again, identifying, kind of orienting yourself where you are at with the bone kind of helps you with these things. So since this is where the humerus is going to articulate in the glenoid fossa, this has got to be the lateral side. So this is going to be the lateral border right here, superior border, and medial border. Okay, so those are the borders. And then the angles, you have your superior angle, inferior angle right here. And then the lateral angle is kind of smushed where the glenoid cavities would be. So it's kind of like if you're to imagine this being a triangle, this point of the triangle is kind of squished in the glenoid cavity. So if I was to ask you for the glenoid cavity or the lateral angle, I'd have to be specific as to which one I'm looking for. So the next on the list is the glenoid fossa. So this is just a socket the head of the humerus fits in right here. And then we have a couple processes. So looking at it kind of at that lateral view, this flat one here that's a little bit more superior, this is the acromion process. And then this one that's a little bit more rounded and a little bit more inferior, this is the coracoid process. Okay. And then the last marking on the scapula is the subscapular fossa. So this whole big indented area, so I'll try to kind of turn it sideways so you can see it's like a big curve. That's your subscapular fossa. All right, so those are the things that you need to know for the scapula. Then the other part of the pectoral girdle is the clavicle. So it's kind of this almost like an S-shaped curved bone. So the clavicle sits kind of anteriorly, your collarbone, and then your scapula sits posterior. So make sure in lab, when you have a chance, look at the articulated skeletons to see how those two bones fit together to make the pectoral girdle, which helps to support your upper appendages. So we only have two markings to go along with the clavicle, and it's basically the two ends. So this more flattened, kind of thinner end here, this is called the acromial end. Okay. And then the other side is a lot thicker and kind of more bulkier. This is the sternal end, because the acromial end articulates with the acromion process of the scapula, actually more like this. Okay. And then the sternal end articulates with the manubrium of the sternum. Okay. So that is your pectoral girdle, the two bones, scapula and clavicle. Right. So now we're going to move on to the humerus. Let's zoom out a little bit. There we go, to see the whole thing. My little stage here is a chair. So that's why you see the little spindles of my chair. All right, so the humerus, let's sit in an anatomical position here. So this is the anterior surface of the humerus, and this is the posterior surface, okay? So, and this is the proximal end, because that's what's going to articulate with the scapula, and this is the distal end. This is what's going to articulate with the radius and ulna. Now, if I to look at this bone, knowing that this is the anterior surface, and this is the ball that's going to fit into the scapula, then I can deduce that this is a right humerus. So if I show you on my arm in the little video, you can see here, the ball is pointing medially, and this is the anterior surface you can identify on that distal end of the bone. Uh-oh. There we go. My phone fell asleep. All right, so that's the anterior surface. And one of the ways you can identify is down here at the distal end. Here you have this kind of indentation. We're going to learn that's called the coronoid fossa. On the reverse side, on the back side, there's another fossa, but look how big and deep that is. That's called the olecranon fossa. So we know that the olecranon is your posterior elbow. So identifying that helps you identify that's the back of the humerus. And the front, there's a little indentation, but it's not as big. So that's the coronoid fossa. So let's go through the markings on the list here. So the first one is the head, which is obvious. This is the head of the humerus. Then they have what's called the anatomical neck versus the surgical neck. So the anatomical neck is this kind of line right here. It kind of separates the smooth part of the ball from these bumpy tubercles that we have here. The surgical neck is an imaginary line that's kind of drawn right around here, like a ring, like where my fingers are. There's a good picture of that in the lab manual. They call it the surgical neck just because that's where they do a lot of repairs, surgically. All right, so now we're going to take a look at some of those tubercles. So tubercles are just bumps, and so we've got two of them here. So if we look at the bone in anatomical position, we can see the greater tubercle is higher up a little bit, and the lesser tubercle is lower. They're about the same size, so it's not like one is greater or lesser than the other than where their position is. So greater tubercle, lesser tubercle. And then this groove, this kind of dent in between, this is the intertubercular groove. And the shaft is just the diaphysis. So this is the shaft. And then kind of about the top 2/3, there's kind of a rough and bumpy area right here, just underneath that intertubercular groove. This is called the deltoid tuberosity. Okay, deltoid tuberosity. And then everything else, all the rest of the markings are down here at the distal end. So we have a couple epicondyles. So epicondyles are attachment points above the condyle. Well, what's a condyle? Condyles are smooth articulating surfaces. So here are your epicondyles. Here's the condyles. They have special names. We're going to learn those in a little bit. So epicondyles are these bumps here, lateral and medial. So if I put this down, again, we can use the clue of the ball of the humerus, because we know that's on the medial side that's pointing towards our shoulder joint, and that makes this be the medial epicondyle. So then this bump here is going to be the lateral epicondyle. Okay, so now we have those two fossas. I've already identified those. So this anterior fossa is the coronoid with an N, coronoid. And on the posterior side, this is the olecranon fossa on the posterior side of the bone. And then those condylar surfaces in the humerus actually have special names. So this one right here, this more rounded one, is called the capitulum. And then this kind of two bump one is called the trochlea. Get under the camera there. So you have your capitulum and your trochlea. Okay. So those are all of the markings on the humerus. Okay. So next we're going to do the lower arm bones, the forearm bones. And here we have the radius and the ulna. So first things first is you got to determine which one's which. The easiest way that I've figured that out is if you take a look at this one that's got this really big, obvious hook shape. If you turn that just so, it makes a U, and U for ulna, right? So that can't be any easier. So the bone that's got the U is the ulna with the big hook shape, okay? So we'll start with that one. So on the ulna, this big hook, the top of the hook, is called the olecranon process. And then we have the inside of the hook is called the trochlear notch, and I'll show you why it's called that here in a second. And the bottom part of the hook here is a coronoid process. So the olecranon process, the coronoid process, like where my thumb is, and then the smooth surface inside is called the trochlear notch. And then on this side, we can kind of see two different sides. There's a little flat space right here, kind of towards the bottom of that hook on one side. And this is called the radial notch. Now I know that sounds weird to have the word radius on ulna, but it's called the radial notch because the radial head sits in that notch. And that's part of your radial ulnar joint right there. And then on the distal end of the the distal end of the ulna, let me get my rib bones. This is called the head, just the whole distal end. And then that little point is called the styloid process. Okay. So most of the markings of the ulna are up here on the proximal. So again, I'll go through. We have the olecranon process. We have the coronoid process. We have the trochlear notch. And we have the radial notch. Okay. And the distal end, we have the head. The whole end of the bone is called the head, and then we have the styloid process right there. Okay, we'll set that aside. And so then we can take a look at the radius. So the radius has also a head, but it's on the proximal, there we go. It's on the proximal side. So they're kind of opposite. So the radial head is proximal, the ulnar head is distal. And then we have this big bump right here. This is called the radial tuberosity. Again, it's just another bump, like a tubercle tuberosity. This is the radial tuberosity. And then down here on the distal end, we have also a styloid process. And then opposite the styloid process, we have this little flat kind of indent here. This is the ulnar notch. Okay, so the radius has the ulnar notch and the ulna has the radial notch. Okay, and so here's why. So I'm going to see if I can fit these together. So the radial head fits in the radial notch here on the proximal end. And then the ulnar head fits in the ulnar notch here at the distal end. Okay, so then the bones, these models don't fit together very well. But radial head into the radial notch on the ulnar head into the ulnar notch on the radius. And then I'll talk more specifically in class about how to tell the difference between right and left, because that's a little bit harder to do on this video tutorial. So I'll do right and left discussion on the radius and ulna in lab. Okay, so then lastly, that brings us to the hand. So all the bones of the hand. This one is a little bit wonky. The wires got bent, but I don't want to bend them too much to break them. So on the hand, we have three sets of bones. So you have your carpals, your metacarpals, and then all of your phalanges are your finger bones. So if I'm going to overlay this over my hand, it's a little bit smaller than my hand, but we can see the wrist bones sit right about there. The metacarpals are like your hand bones. That's where your hand is, okay, like the palm and your hand. And then the phalanges are your finger bones. Okay, so you have three finger bones, with the exception of your thumb only has two. Okay? So for the carpals, they each have their own specific name that you do need to know and identify them. There's a couple different mnemonics I'll share with you during lab time that might help you remember. So the one that always helps with me is going to start with this big peanut-shaped one on the thumb side. So this is the thumb, proximal row. So it's closest to your radius. So this is some lovers try positions and then go back to the thumb, distal row, that they can't handle. I'll share that in lab too. You'll probably hear that again. So that represents your scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. So those are probably the most challenging parts. I think for me it was to learn those. And so whatever you need to do to memorize the correct naming for the carpal bones, whatever works for you. So then the metacarpal bones are really easy because they're just numbered 1 through 5, starting with the thumb. So again, here's the thumb. That's digit number 1. So this is metacarpal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the right hand. So you will only ever see a hand that's articulated. I won't give you disarticulated carpals, metatarsals, or metacarpals or phalanges. They'll all be articulated. So it'll be really easy to identify left and right on your hands. Then for the phalanges, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we just do proximal, distal, phalanx number 1, proximal, middle, distal number 2, proximal, middle, distal number 3, proximal, middle, distal number 4, proximal, middle, distal number 5. So those are all really easy. So just numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for the metacarpals, proximal, distal, proximal, middle, distal, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for the phalanges. Okay, and that is our tour of the upper appendage. So I will see you for another video.